Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob Moore, Executive Director of the Architectural League. On behalf of our staff and board, I want to thank you all for joining us for this event, the second in our series, Architecture, Planning, and International Law, made possible by support from the Graham Foundation for the Arts, as well as by public funds from the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of the Office of the Governor, and the New York State Legislature. Our board member, Brad Samuels, was also instrumental in shaping and pushing forward today's conversation, so I want to thank him specifically. We'll hear shortly from our moderator, Anjali Perrine, with information about how things will unfold, as well as with introductions for our panelists. But first, I'd like to offer some institutional background on the series itself. From climate change to military aggression, many challenges do not respect sovereign borders and require global coordinated responses. The system of international law was set up precisely to address such challenges, finding its present configuration largely in the aftermath of World War II. But with the current interconnected rise of authoritarian nationalist regimes all around the world, this legal system is under threat. In addition to law, architecture and planning expertise informs these systems. Aspects of the interplay between the built environment and international law include territorial disputes, flows of labor and materials, the causes and effects of climate change, and the willful destruction of civilian infrastructure, which the first event in the series on Domicide focused on last spring. And I think Damasi is sharing some links in the chat, so check those out if you're able. As an institution dedicated to the support of transformational work in architecture and the allied fields, the Architectural League is committed to making space for education and action on these themes. How are architecture and planning both agents and effects in the machinations of international law, and where is this system and the built environment's place in it headed? Historically, cultural heritage is perhaps one of the more well-known spheres of built and legal jurisdictional overlap. But the identification, designation, and defense of sites with both tangible and intangible, as they say, cultural significance, is a rapidly changing theoretical and professional landscape. In a recent event organized by MIT's Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism, historian of planning Lawrence Vail offered 5 questions regarding what he calls the, quote, design politics that are often activated in these processes, always with winners and losers. Those 5 questions were: whose heritage is evicted? Whose heritage is priced out? Whose heritage is placed elsewhere? Whose heritage is conserved? And whose heritage gets rebuilt? As you can imagine, the range of cases where such design politics are invoked is staggeringly wide. It includes sites threatened by geopolitical ambitions and war, such as Palestine, Ukraine, and Mali, sites threatened by development, such as Tanzania's Ngorongoro National Park and in downtown Cairo, and sites threatened by climate change, such as this winter's fires in Los Angeles and pollution at the Taj Mahal. Diverse as this list is, and fragile as its own systems have become, international law remains one of the only spheres wherein accountability and redress relative to the effects of such design politics can currently be sought. And as noted, it's not only lawyers who make its systems function. Through their stewardship of the built environment, architects and planners can shed light on the key techniques and consequences of cultural heritage's destruction, protection, and weaponization. So in this event, we'll hear from speakers with new and critical approaches to exactly this work. They'll share shifting legal frameworks, critical technological tools, and urgent historical lessons. At a time when it's easy to get stuck in the daily drama of national politics here in the US, or worse, to stick our heads in the sand. With this series, our hope is to urge all of us, architects, planners, and beyond, to keep our views wide in the name of international solidarity and to seek new and meaningful ways to deploy our professional expertise. So now I'll pass it along to the conversation's moderator, Anjali Perrine, who will introduce our panelists. Perrine is a human rights advocate and lawyer. Her practice and research focus on areas of armed conflict and international criminal law, colonialism and its impacts, discrimination and inequality, and socioeconomic rights. Perrine serves as an expert witness and has worked alongside forensic scientists to carry out complex war crime investigations, including for international and hybrid courts. She's an assistant clinical professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School, where she also directs the Global Human Rights Clinic. So thank you again to all of you for joining us, and I'll pass it along now to Anjali to do introductions of the panelists.
Thanks very much, Jacob. And thank you so much to the entire team at the Architectural League for putting together this really terrific event, which, as you note, is part of your broader series on international law, architecture, and planning. I think it's very rare that an international lawyer like myself is able to be in an architectural space, and I'm really grateful for the kind of interdisciplinarity that you really bring to the field. For today's event, what we'll do is we'll have 3 presentations by our speakers, followed by a Q&A. Please feel free to send over your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any point. I'll introduce all of the speakers kind of at once in order of their presentations, and then we'll go straight into all 3 presentations before turning over to the Q&A. So in order of their presentations, our 3 panelists today are Alexandra Zantaki, who is the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. Well known for her work on migrant, minority, and indigenous rights, Zantaki's publications range from issues related to cultural diversity, cultural heritage, balancing cultural rights, and the multicultural aspects of international human rights law. She's a professor of laws at Brunel University of London and a member of the Athens Bar, as well as a member of the Oxford Human Rights Faculty. Her forthcoming report, under her mandate as Special Rapporteur to the Human Rights Council, will be on artificial intelligence and creativity. So our second panelist is Maxime Rokmaniko, who is an architect, researcher, and educator. His work integrates advanced spatial analysis and visualization techniques to address critical issues of history, media, ecology, and justice. As founding director for the Center for Spatial Technologies, a Kiev and Berlin-based practice, he leads groundbreaking work in critical spatial research. CST's projects have been showcased at the Venice Architecture Biennale and Louisiana Museum of Modern Art and covered in Dizate in the New York Times. A Fulbright scholar, Rokmanica has lectured and led workshops at the Architectural Association, Royal College of Art, Columbia University, and Yale Law School. And rounding out our panelists is Nadi Abusada, who is an architect and historian. He is currently an assistant professor at the School of Architecture and Design at the American University of Beirut, and was previously a postdoctoral fellow at MIT and ETH Zurich. Abusada is the editor-in-chief of Arab Urbanism and a policy member of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. Abusada has published 2 edited volumes and written numerous articles on the history and politics of architecture and urban planning in Palestine and the Arab region, and is an editorial contributor at the Architectural Review. So we'll start first with Alexandra to talk about cultural rights, followed by Maxime and Nadi.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. Today I am going to talk to you a little bit about my work and my main goal as the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. UN Special Rapporteurs are independent experts who are elected by the main human rights body of the United Nations, the Human Rights Council. We are pro bono, so we're not getting paid, and we are there for 6 years, and our main aim is to monitor the implementation of our specific mandate, or the specific right we are in charge of. And my right is cultural rights. There is a UN Special Rapporteur on housing that talked to you last year, but also on right to life, expression, association, etc. And there are also mandates focused on countries. At the moment, the UN Special Rapporteur on occupied Palestinian territories are is quite busy, as you can imagine. There is one on Russia, Russian Federation, etc. And when I looked at the topic, I thought that maybe I should start by what are the main international systems, regimes that regulate cultural heritage. And we have mainly 3 regimes. One is one is UNESCO. UNESCO has been very active in ensuring the protection and advocating for the protection of cultural heritage per se. The second one is humanitarian law. So the various bodies, Red Cross and etc., that try to protect cultural heritage in times of war or in times of emergencies. And then it is the United Nations, and the United Nations are not really focused on the protection of culture per se and cultural heritage per se, but on the right of everyone to their cultural heritage. And some of you are going to say that, well, isn't it the same? But actually it is not the same. Sometimes it is, the two are in conflict. So it's very often that states go to protect the natural beauty of a national park in Asia or in Africa. But in order to do this, and also UNESCO, they have the UNESCO award. But in order to do this, they feel that they have to push out and relocate the indigenous peoples who live in this area. And this is what happened. Very well-known case of Tanzania and Ngorongoro. But it happens, quite often. So I am here to insist that you cannot really have protection of cultural heritage unless you protect cultural rights. And when we talk about cultural rights, we talk about the rights of everyone to participate in the cultures, in cultural life. This means everyone, whether somebody is a citizen of the state or it is not somebody who is just a migrant, somebody, an indigenous community, local populations, minorities, etc. And I think this, the protection of cultural rights when the organization or the state wants to protect cultural heritage it has some, very important directions to what the 5 questions that were put by the famous architects that we talked about earlier. So first of all, and these are international obligations that states have undertaken to protect. To respect. So they're not just aspirations, they're not good practice. We're not there to say, well done to the states who do it. This is what the states have thought about and decided to sign and ratify these provisions that say that this is what they're going to do. So what they are going to do is, first of all, they're going to allow for everyone to participate actively and meaningfully on what is meant by cultural heritage. So what is the difference of culture as opposed to cultural heritage? Well, cultural heritage is, some objects or customs or practices or natural beauty that the source communities decide that have to be protected. So it is not going to be the planner on her own, and it is not going to be the architect on their own, nor the ministry official that is going to decide that this is what has to be protected or that is what has to be protected. This is the first issue. The second issue is that, by everyone to participate, it means that everyone will want to protect not only the state cultural heritage, but, their own cultural heritage. So, it is not to protect only the prevailing or the cultural heritage of the elite. And I think that this is very important, and we see this unfortunately not being respected in many areas. So if we take, for example, Ukraine, it is interesting, and there's a lot of talk about a lot of funds being coming in, protecting and plans to protect the cultural heritage of Ukraine in the post-war era. But really, it should be the cultural heritage in Ukraine in the post-war era. And it should not be just the cultural heritage, the Ukrainian cultural heritage, nor the Greek Orthodox, or some people have been saying, but it should also be, and this is very difficult, but this is what the state has undertaken to do, also the cultural heritage of the enemy, of the Russians in Ukraine. Why? Because the Russian are individuals. They don't necessarily have connection to the decisions, the bad, terrible decisions of the Russian Federation to invade. And they have the right to their identity. They have the right to their visions, to their priorities as well. Everyone has the right to participate. Secondly, this means that it is not only so, this idea is very much about, losers and winners, and not just implement and protect the cultural heritage of winners. And this relates to the narratives, because of course, the moment you protect the cultural heritage of, specific parts of the population, this means that the narrative of what has happened and the history of what has happened changes. So it is very interesting at the moment that in Serbia, there is a big demonstration and a big upheaval that started and is led by students, which is really admirable, to stop the authoritarian regime. And what the regime has done is that they wanted to get rid of the Hotel Yugoslavia, because they said that this had bad memories for what happened there, torture, etc. From the Gestapo in the Second World War. Well, we're not here to protect only the heroic parts of our past, and we're not here to protect only, what fits very well in our narrative of the glorious nation, whatever nation we belong to. And I think that this is very important. Also, when we talk about cultural heritage of everyone, we mean, of course, as a lot of you know, the indigenous peoples. And the indigenous peoples do not only have the right to participate, but because of the historical injustices they have suffered, because of the how much their cultures have been disrespected and undermined, they have, and because of their sovereignty, they have free, prior, and informed consent. So they're the ones to decide, which parts of their heritage are going to be preserved. And they have to be in these, committees that decide these issues, not just as a voice, but, to lead the process and to have, to be, and their opinion, their collective opinion, to be respected. And sometimes this is very difficult and there are a lot of tensions, but it is up to the state to explain to the non-indigenous populations and to the world why, indigenous peoples should actually, according to international standards, have the first say. And the same happens with minorities. We see very often that minorities are completely disregarded when it comes to the protection of cultural heritage. I think that we have to recognize states are very kind of very clear in saying the big words of how cultural heritage is a positive a part of our identity, a transformational concept. And it is. Cultural heritage is about our identity, about who we are and who we have been and who we want to be in the future. It's about our visions. It's about our core, our psyche. However, the protection of cultural heritage can be a positive element for the cohesion in the state, for the truth about the past in the state, or can be a negative, can bring negative results in pushing for nationalism, in pushing for chauvinism, and for this idea that our group, be it a nation or a part of the population, is above other groups. And I think that architects and planners have a lot to contribute in this debate, because we lawyers can talk in theoretical terms, but we don't really know exactly the tools that we need in order to implement what international law standards say. So, for example, the United Nations has been very eager to talk about SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals did not have culture nor cultural rights as a goal, but did talk about cultural heritage. However, it did not talk about cultural rights. And I think that a lot of organizations, but led by United Cities and local governments, have tried to say that in the post-2030 agenda, cultural rights must be there, and the protection of cultural heritage must be followed and infused by cultural rights. In essence, there can be no sustainable development and no sustainable planning unless in any part of the world, unless it takes into account the identities, the histories, the traumas, the bleak points, but also the important points of every part of the population. And it allows for everyone to participate in different ways to the planning of what the future and the future of where they're going to live and their children and their grandchildren are going to live is going to be. So international human rights laws and international cultural rights are very essential in the planning and the architecture when it comes to cultural heritage and the protection of cultural heritage. Thank you.
Everyone, I guess this is the place where I jump in. As kindly introduced, my name is Maxim, and I represent the teamwork of the Center for Spatial Technologies. I'll share a couple of projects that we've been involved in, and together they, I think, will offer a dimension of our work with urban space and cultural heritage in Ukraine. So the first case that I'm going to very briefly show is how we started to do this type of work. Here you can see two aerial images, one taken from a German reconnaissance plane and one from a satellite. And this is the site of Babin Yar in Kyiv. It's one of the major Holocaust sites. It's important because before the phase of Holocaust that everyone knows very well in terms of gas chambers and this kind of industrial extermination of people, in early phases of the war, the Jews and all the other kind of minorities were killed by bullets. So this is a place where in 1941, people were brought to these ravines in Kyiv and kind of killed in mass. So this is known as a Holocaust by bullets, and this is one of those sites where the territory where these events happened got very much terraformed during the Soviet time. So here on the right, you can see that the network of ravines where all of these events happened was developed in the 60s and 70s, and now there is a park and kind of a highway and residential development on top of these sites. So our group was involved in the project of digital reconstruction, trying to understand the terrain of how it was and understand its transformation over the Soviet period. And it might be shocking to hear to some, but there were actually arguments among historians where these photographs were taken because of this very strong change of spirit of this place, and our work involved forensic analysis of these photographs, and we actually managed to quite precisely locate them using these archival topographic drawings and turning them into spatial models, and then identifying distinct elements of this terrain on the models and archive footage. So trying to understand this place and therefore reconstruct where these famous photographs of the aftermath were taken. Again, my presentation will be quite brief. For the sake of time, I will try to kind of skip a lot of details, so forgive me if kind of there's things that are unclear. I encourage you to check these projects on our website. But here I'm mostly going to show kind of the nature of this work. So here, as you can see, it was very important for us to understand where certain photographs were taken and therefore where these events were taken. For example, the residents of these buildings would not even know that they live right on top of the ravine where the mass shootings of 1941 happened. So this was our work. Based on this work, there was an architecture competition that was won by a German based company called Sub, who are architects, and they proposed this so-called kurgan of memory that was actually the construction of it started before the full-scale invasion. It now stands as a ruin on this site, and you can see the terrain of Babyn Yar here as a scaled model. The idea was to make this kind of reconstruction of the historic terrain that was lost inside of this structure. So this was the work that we were involved right before the full-scale invasion, and it's a project where we spent a lot of time working with archive materials, photographs, videos, maps, but also documents from trials. German officers who were perpetrators in this case, and some of the few surviving witnesses were quite in detail questioned, but also these trials are kind of very performative, so there's a lot of ideological pressures on these materials. So our work was to understand each of these locations on the way of people to Babyn Yar, and also try to spatially reconstruct them, reading and knowing these documents. So when events in Ukraine started to unfold, we knew very well how these types of documents age. We were quite critical of certain types of agendas that were very hard to kind of take apart and understand the case when we were studying Babyn Yar. And quite early in the course of Russian invasion of Ukraine, we started to look at Mariupol, and particularly at the case of Mariupol Drama Theater. I will play a very short video that kind of explains this case in a fast way. So you'll see a short video in a second.
Вы здесь, здесь. Куда вы ходите? Где ребенок? Пойдемте к машине.
On 16 March 2022, the Russian Air Force bombed Mariupol's drama theatre, which at its peak served as a refuge for up to 2,000 people. Hundreds are estimated to have been killed in the blast. A few minutes after the explosion, those who survived can be seen exiting the theatre for the last time. On 28 March, the Russian forces captured the city center. As part of covering up their crimes, they quickly began falsifying evidence and used the ruins of the theatre as a backdrop for fascist victory propaganda. At the end of 2022, they boxed in the theatre with scaffolding and bulldozed most of the remaining structure to the ground. We seek to explode this black box of denial by assembling a growing archive of evidence related to the theater's history and wartime transformation. We collected and analyzed thousands of photos, videos, and social media posts and located them within a 3D model. This model was brought to life through over 100 hours of witness interviews conducted using a technique called situated testimony. The collaborative process of reconstruction allowed survivors to walk through the virtual model to facilitate recollection and fill in the missing details. As each witness recalled their part in this complex event, the model became an assemblage of collective memory. As we enter and move through the theater, space by space, we recount how this cultural landmark gave way to a community engaged in collective habitation, mutual care, and joint decision-making. The archive we've assembled tells the story of a building that, at the epicenter of high-intensity warfare,
became an entire city. Sorry, the video got cut before it ended, but yeah, I guess this short clip summarizes the work quite well. But I'll just add that we were in a way lucky that the Soviets built these theaters in a standard way. So they used standard projects, modifying the facade but keeping things within relatively consistent. So since we have, I assume, at least part audience of architects, I thought you guys might be curious to know that we actually managed to go to one of these theaters that are not occupied by Russia and make 3D scans of them. This was a very interesting experience because we could work with witnesses using LiDAR models, very detailed. At some point, we actually even decided to kind of step away from this because we realized this is too immersive and too kind of detailed. I guess one of the ways to conceptually summarize this endeavor is that our goal was to corroborate testimonies of witnesses, but not in a kind of traditional sense that they're kind of corroborated one against of another. We tried to collect this scaffolding of media. In this case, for example, images, videos, all kinds of pieces of evidence that we could gather around witness testimonies to make them stronger and to give them more gravitas. And again, here there is this kind of situation where Russia is claiming that these people exploded themselves, obviously. So it's quite important for us to show the civilian nature of this place, the kind of ways that people were living in this theater and trying to survive it, to survive there, using it as a bomb shelter. So these are the witnesses that we worked with. These are the people who organized this this community. I'll play another clip where you can see how the testimony process works.
Я по факту место не выбирала, потому что когда я пришла, уже моя подруга была там, они заняли вот этот уголок, вот тут, і тут плюс-мінус безопасно.
Третя колона зліва, десь ми тут були. Оце наше було місце.
Здесь вот между двух колонн ниша, она в ширину, ну я не знаю, 2 каремата.
Ось, отут ми сиділи між оцими колонами. Ми тут же собрали дітей. 2 діток, старший Артем, 7 років виповнилося, а менша Настя, їй виповнилося 3 роки. А ми вот здесь расстелили этот штору. А у нас было кресло компьютерное, возле колонны оно у нас стояло.
Спинкою доверху, так?
Да. Ми потім взяли деталь з цього, з декорацій і поставили перед цією колоною, бо нам дуло з виходу.
Отут
Да, да. Просто у нас лежали діти, щоб їм не так дуло. А навпроти нас у нас там було колони і стояли ці стульчики. Ну, не стульчики, а кресла для этого, в театрі, на которых сидят. Нам просто, щоб лягти, ми загороджували прохід, коли лягали. У нас тут не лишалося простору, щоб пройти.
So lastly, these kinds of elements were kind of combined together in one model. It was quite interesting to see the polyphony of these witness testimonies manifesting in space. So, for example, this is the kind of elements that our witnesses produced in the course of these situated testimonies superimposed onto the space of the theater. You can kind of understand the spatial organization of the theater without any elements that were there before. So all of this stuff is how people dragged chairs from the auditorium to sleep on them, organized these little kind of spaces for taking care of children or cooking food. And in the end of every witness testimony that is presented on our website, we have this theater model that is spinning. And you can see elements that each particular witness contributed to the kind of general image of how this theater was occupied. So here you can see the kind of all these witness models coming together as one. I thought it would be important to mention that right now the Russians are reconstructing this building. Speaking about who gets what reconstructed, if we were involved into this process of digital reconstruction of the events and of everything that preceded lives being lost and basically a war crime being committed, here you can see the Russian side kind of covering this site with culture, putting portraits of both Russian and Ukrainian writers on the scaffolding, and the theater is now close to be fully reconstructed as if nothing happened. So we keep watching the site, but I think that, again, this is a moment where it matters a lot what's happening in physical space and how kind of reality is being shaped by the people who control this site. So again, just before I finish, I wanted to say that right now we are working on a film about a completely different place. It's called Khersones in Crimea. It's one of the UNESCO heritage sites that are now being kind of built over and manipulated by the Russian side. So if you're interested to see some of our new work, you should follow along at specialtech.info. I think I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thank you for organizing this event. I'll pass the mic to the next presenter. Nadia, you're muted.
Oh, thanks for letting me know. Hello, everyone. Thanks to the previous speakers. I hope you can see my screen. So what I'll do today is talk a little bit about the destruction of culture in the context of Palestine. And what I thought would be important to do is to not only talk about the current events and war in Gaza, but also to give broader context to the destruction of Palestinian cultural heritage. And I'll start with this quote, it might seem quite obvious that those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. So this is just to say that when we talk about cultural heritage, it is very much a question of the past, that is also equally a question about our current preoccupations and concerns. Perhaps the main argument here, but also historical fact, is that the destruction of culture in the case of Palestine did not start in recent years. It actually dates back to the year 1948, the year of the Arab-Israeli War, which resulted in the displacement and ethnic cleansing of nearly 700,000 Palestinians outside of historic Palestine. And so that really marks the moment for when not only people are driven off their lands and properties, but also where their cultural heritage is also threatened and destroyed. This is a little quote from Khalil al-Sakakini. The picture is a bit blurry, but he was a main key intellectual in Palestinian cultural life before the year 1948. Someone who had spoken in various international and regional congresses, especially on Arabic literature. And in the year 1948, after the Zionist militias had occupied his neighborhood of Katamon, he was forever displaced out of his house. And a year later, while in Cairo, this is what he wrote in his diaries. Farewell, my library. Farewell, the house of wisdom, the abode of philosophers, a house and a witness for the literature. How many sleepless nights I spent there, reading and writing. The night is silent and the people asleep. Now, of course, Khalil Sakakini was one among hundreds of Palestinians who had lost their books in their own homes during the 1948 war. And the irony is that many of these were actually looted and are now stored in the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem. On the left, you can see an actual photograph from some of the books on the shelves of the library. And one of them mentions Sari Sakakini in Arabic, who's actually the son of Khalil Sakakini. But also you'll notice the letters AP on most of the books. And that is an indication for abandoned property, which is the legal designation that Israel decided would be fitting for the looted collections from Palestinian libraries. But this issue of abandoned property did not merely apply to objects and artifacts, it also applied to properties. Here on the very right, you see one of the pioneer Palestinian architects, Andoni Baramki, who had studied in Athens at the turn of the century and returned to Jerusalem to construct modern buildings, like many of his regional counterparts. And what happens in 1948 is that it happened that Andoni Baramki's house was on the wrong side of Jerusalem after it was divided between East and West Jerusalem. And so he lost his house, which became also designated as an abandoned property. And he spent his whole life actually battling Israeli courts, thinking that he might regain access to it, but to no resolve. These are some mental maps that his son, Gabi Baramki, who would later become head of one of the leading Palestinian universities, drew of the family house that he grew up in, and that was built by his father, Andoni Baramki. This is a picture of the house, and you can see people gathering in front of a little siege, and that actually was the threshold or the barrier between East and West Jerusalem in 1948. And so someone like Andoni would have been on this side of the picture, unable to access his home, which he could see but never enter. And since then, many Palestinians who were forcibly exiled, because some of them managed to get foreign citizenships, Many of them managed to actually return to Palestine, but not as citizens, instead as visitors. This includes the late intellectual Edward Said, who was then professor at Columbia University, and he returned to his home, and this was documented in a BBC documentary at the time. And he talks about how he couldn't actually enter his home, and instead was just looking at it from the outside. Some people managed to enter, some people didn't. But the overall story is that Palestinians have not been able to return to their properties from which they were displaced. And this applies to both individual cases, but also more broader sites or sites where the broader public would identify with, and sometimes entire neighborhoods. This is the example of the Moroccan quarter in the old city of Jerusalem, actually right next to the Burak Wall or the Wailing Wall. And in the year 1967, so following the Arab-Israeli War and the Israeli occupation of the remainder part of Jerusalem, one of the early orders of action was the destruction of this entire quarter that had been built since the 13th century. So in a matter of hours, you destroy nearly 8 centuries of the city's history. On the left, we see what the Moroccan quarter was like before 1967. And on the right, we see it today. And you'll notice not only the plaza that is open right in front of the Wailing Wall, but also the subterranean excavations that Israel is also undertaking beneath the Holy City. And many experts are saying they're actually threatening some of the historic structures that exist in Jerusalem, including the Dome of the Rock, which you can see very closely to this site. Now, the gentleman who actually ordered the destruction of the Moroccan quarter was this guy, Moshe Dayan, who was a minister of defense and a military commander during the Israeli 1967 war, excuse me. And it's not incidental here that you see him in front of these pharaonic era artifacts. And that's because Moshe Dayan not only ordered the destruction of several urban spaces within Palestine, but he was also a systematic looter of Palestinian archaeology. And so the same artifacts that we see behind him would actually later end up in the Israeli Museum and are placed, exhibited there today. So this is to say that this is not merely the will and the decision of individuals. This is also action that is state-sanctioned and that is systematic across the board within the Israeli political but also cultural landscape. Sometimes entire museums were looted. I mean, that was the case with the Palestine Archaeological Museum, which was built in the 1930s by a British architect, but very much to serve the Palestinian public in all its diverse communities. And so, again, this is one of the buildings that were entirely confiscated and looted in 1967. And placed under Israeli control. This is a picture of the museum before 1948. And on the right is the Palestinian curator who was involved in excavating several archaeological sites from where these objects arrived. His name is Dimitri Baramki. And in 1948, he was, like many other Palestinians, forcibly exiled to or displaced to Lebanon, and he then became the curator of the archaeological museum here at the American University of Beirut. But also the question or the issue of looting and cultural destruction would not be limited to the confines of historic Palestine. It would also follow these figures to places like Beirut. It would follow exiled Palestinians outside of the boundaries of Palestine itself. And so this is just some photo from the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, where the PLO Research Center, which housed a library but also an archive, was entirely looted, only to be released later in a prisoners exchange deal. And so it's a really big question, and it remains a question as to where are these items and objects today. I mean, there are several scholars trying to excavate that, but what we know is far less than what we don't know, actually. But as an architect, I also like to talk about the landscape itself. And recently, I don't know if you followed the news of the Jerusalem wildfires a few weeks ago. And actually, there's a whole history as to why this particular breed of trees is susceptible to fire. And actually, that's because the Jewish National Fund had planted them throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century. And after 1948, in large part to try and obscure some of the destroyed Palestinian villages that are hidden still until today under those trees. And with the fires, actually, which are a result of the fact that these are not native plants, but also what happened consequently is that they revealed some of these traces of pre-1948 Palestinian villages, which have been deliberately obscured from view using, under the pretense, of course, of natural preservation and greenification, which we know is more greenwashing than actual ecological care. So this is just one example where someone is trying to place the marks of that history onto the photograph of these sites. Another case of burying evidence, and the literal burying of evidence in this case, is this project which the London-based team Forensic Architecture had launched, where they were trying to look into some of the burial grounds for the massacres of 1948, and actually found out that one of the major sites of burial was beneath this car park. And so using new technologies of satellite mapping, but also analysis and remote sensing and whatnot, new kinds of scholarship is emerging that is trying to unpack what Israel is trying to do since 1948, not only in actively destroying Palestinian cultural heritage and in this case Palestinian bodies, right? But also how this is taking place. Now, I won't be long talking about the Gaza war. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the things that you see every day on TV. But this is just some basic facts around the destructions when it comes to culture, right? We're talking about more than 50 artists and cultural workers, 200 heritage sites, libraries, museums, art galleries, cultural centers, archives, and paintings. Of course, these are the ones that are counted, and many more are not counted. There's a project here where I work at the Beirut Urban Lab, trying to map out the herbicide block by block, and actually building by building, trying to measure the amount of devastation. But what's important is that it's also trying to record not only sites that would be traditionally deemed as cultural heritage, but also people's stories and narratives around these places and their memories with them. And I think that's quite important in how we understand heritage. There's also work that is being done to try and preserve as the destruction is taking place, which is quite unique to Gaza. In this case, this is some of the work that was done in the Omari Mosque in Gaza, by a cultural preservation center in Palestine. There's also the work of the Palestinian Museum, which I've been involved in for the past 2 years, where we're trying to provide people with the tools and instruments to understand cultural destruction in Gaza beyond images of media. And so to broaden a bit the landscape of our understanding of Gaza and its history, and its successive wars, that this is not merely a product of the present, this is something that has been ongoing for decades. And also there's some historical context and how international solidarity can happen. I'll quickly skim through some of the sites that have been destroyed. This is a Madhaf Museum, and you can see it before and after. You can also see here a different museum, a Carrara Museum. Similarly, the destruction, but also trying to renovate as much as possible during the ceasefire, the short ceasefire that was taking place a month or so ago. Here you see the workers trying to carefully maintain, but also catalog the objects that they're rescuing. Here we see the cataloging process, maintaining scientific integrity while also working under the most rough imaginable conditions. I'll go very quickly. Here we see some textiles which have been taken out of Gaza and are now undergoing some renovation outside. We see here the boxes, the food boxes being used for storage, really makeshift attempts at recovery. But I'll end with these perhaps important 5 notes for the reconstruction, how we think of reconstruction, especially as architects, including Gaza, but also beyond that. First is to move from this idea of reconstruction which merely focuses on the material objects, to talk about recovery. So you talk about the social and economic and cultural dimensions of the built environment. Second is challenging the pessimism which has prevailed over assessments of recovery, whether by the United Nations or other international organizations, which deem nearly impossible the recovery of Gaza, which I think is not merely a technical assessment, but also a political one. The third point is agency, right? And this was previously mentioned in the previous presentations, centering the people of Gaza, right? And not exceptionalizing them in the process of recovery, looking at cultural heritage beyond objects and key monuments and looking at everyday spaces, imagining Gaza beyond the confines of partition and siege, which it had been confined to for nearly 20 years, and thinking of the question of self-determination, and not merely trying to reconstruct the dependency of the people of Gaza to Israeli colonial rule. I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nadi. So I'll invite all of the panelists to switch on their videos so that we can have an open discussion. And for those of you who wish to ask questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A, and I'll make sure to try to get through as many as possible. Thank you so much for such a fascinating set of both broad discussions and kind of specific examples of ways in which people are trying to document the destruction of cultural heritage and thinking about cultural rights and cultural heritage in really interesting ways. I think, you know, this question that sort of seems to really come throughout all of the presentations around whose culture and you know, what are cultural rights and who gets to define them is really crucial, and questions of agency. And then, you know, Nadi, both yourself and Maxime's presentation really looked at kind of the role of architects and architecture in terms of both truth-telling and truth-seeking exercise and a kind of documentation exercise, as well as a way to think about connecting histories with memory and memorialization, and kind of thinking about that as both the past, the present, and the future. And so maybe to kind of start off with a question For you, Maxime, one of the things that I was really struck by with your work, both the prior work before the war began, and also some of the work trying to document the attack on the Mariupol theater, is the kind of power and value of architectural tools and spatial analysis to actually do an investigation itself. And so the role of architectural tools in as a means of accountability rather than just kind of to document what happened. And I wanted to know what you think and whether you think about your work as a way to actually make it easier for people to tell their stories, to be able to situate them, and to be able to make it more accessible and understandable.
Yes, thank you for that. You put it quite well. I do think that, for example, as a dweller of Kyiv for quite a long time, the story of Babyn Yar is in a way more complex because people don't understand where those events happened. And when you understand spatial configuration of any event, you kind of understand it much better. It's also important for Mariupol case because we kind of like went to the scale that is very, very granular. And that's something that's in a way relatable, and it kind of shifts away this abstraction of like, oh, there's like tons of people being bombed in Mariupol, like complete city is being destroyed. There's something quite powerful about that kind of human scale. But if I may, I just wanted to ask one question of Alexandra really quick, because something you said frankly bothered me quite a bit. Like I obviously understand that, you know, like it's important to preserve cultural rights, and you know, like it's always nice to say that, you know, like everyone has a right for the space for kind of their culture to be preserved. But it was quite strange to hear that you bring about this example of Russian culture in Ukraine as something that needs to be protected, particularly because of, you know, generations and centuries of kind of destruction and oppression of Ukrainian culture. And like, it's just the question of like, why did you decide to bring that as an example of something that needs to be preserved? Why not Ukrainian culture in Russia? I appreciated that Nadi showed all of these examples that I actually had in my head for Palestine also, because, you know, quite famously, it's not only that Palestinian cultural heritage is being completely destroyed right now and from starting from the second half of the 20th century, we also have Israel weaponizing their own archaeology on Palestinian territory, making these kind of scientific discoveries that then are kind of like used to justify warfare. And that is even more obvious example where kind of like using this argument of kind of culture of oppressor also needs to be preserved is something that's like relatively like seems like it's not really needed to make that argument. So I was wondering why you wanted to point that out.
So you don't think that the you don't think that the cultural heritage of the Russian
Yeah,
cultural
as I said,
heritage
this is an obvious thing. Obviously, it does, but the fact that you're bringing up that example seems quite problematic.
Okay, so the reason why is because okay, so I've been the first special rapporteur that actually talked about the illegal invasion of the Russian Federation. So I am very clear that we are talking about an illegal invasion, and I have been, you know, participating actually in, you know, there was also a Sky documentary about Mariupol, and it's amazing, you know, a terrible what the Russian plans are for Mariupol. They want to destroy completely the historical center, and, you know, to create, they say now that they're going to create big, at least this is what was happening some months ago, that they were going to create big, important living conditions for the people in Mariupol. So, you know, I come from a place of good understanding who is the aggressor here and who is the victim. But what I am saying is that when international law talks about everyone, and when we talk about human rights, we have to see human rights distinct from political causes and from polarization and from political aims. So I don't think that, I think that the winners of any war, and this is why I was trying, because I was assuming that hopefully the Ukrainians are going to be the winners of this war. So what I was saying is that the winners of this war have to be, in any war, have to be attentive and careful about the losers and about the aggressors. At the same time, I have talked quite a lot about, other wars, but also other issues relating to this. So I think that the problem with cultural heritage is that sometimes the right to cultural heritage is being seen as a political aim by states. You're absolutely right. Russians have used, actually, the reason why this war started, according to the Russians, is because, they said that there is no real Ukrainian nation. So I'm very aware that they misuse cultural rights. But because they misuse cultural rights, there is no reciprocity. So that's why I said it, because we have a very obvious war and because all of us stand behind the Ukrainians. But even in this case, where we have a very clear aggressor and a very clear party that is not the aggressors, we have to ensure that human rights, so the rights of individuals, are preserved. That's why I brought it up.
Alexander, can I ask maybe, actually my question was maybe going to build a little bit on that, but maybe at a broader level. I was kind of struck by the ways in which you sort of articulate cultural rights as being, both universal and absolutely necessary to be defined kind of outside of what is a state narrative of what is history, what is memory, what are cultural artifacts. I was wondering whether you had thought about, or you had a kind of framework for trying to figure out, though, like who decides, because inevitably you have this kind of power imbalance, where the state is in charge, the state has resources, even this event is being funded by, a state agency. And so how do you build a framework to actually ensuring that you get that individual sort of people power to determine and for themselves what are their cultural rights and what is their cultural heritage?
I think, but by ensuring that public bodies, realize what are their obligations. And I don't think that this is the case yet. I don't think that the military realize that they don't just have to protect the building, they have to protect, the right of the individuals to decide which buildings are going to get priorities of the local individuals. I don't think that the states have realized that through the communications that I make to them, that it is in these committees that decide on cultural heritage committee, the individuals in civil society not only have to attend, but they have to have a meaningful participation. In my own country, in Greece, the Ministry of Culture passed last year a law that says that in order to protect the Greek language, I can't remember whether it's 40 or 50% of all the music that is played in public spaces has to be Greek or of Greek language. Who says that the Greek language is in danger? Who says that this is the way to preserve it? What happens to multiculturalism? So I think that, there are ways, handbooks, training courses that happens to military and to public bodies talk about the preservation of cultural heritage. They say nothing about the cultural rights. Somebody asked about the conservation of the big NGOs that look at the conservation of nature. In my time in Laos, I had my official visit to Laos. I saw how Western big development agencies use the preservation of natural beauty in order to push out the locals, and then they get into co-management programs in order to make the locals patrol the forests so that their neighbors do not go to do what they've been doing for hundreds of years, hunt and exist in the forests. So first of all, be aware of the obligations, and secondly, try to use the tools that we have, and we have some tools, So treaty bodies and, international bodies, etc., and so you know these bodies pretty well. So, try to use the human rights bodies and the humanitarian bodies in a way that the right to cultural heritage is protected, not just cultural heritage per se.
Thanks. That's really really helpful, and that's a very useful framework to think through. Nadi, as you were presenting, I was struck by both the kind of volume and quantity of the cultural heritage destruction that you see, but also the different forms that it takes. And I think, much of our discussion today and much of the presentations today, given the kind of thematic focus and the areas in which you work, are both yourself and Maxime are focused on kind of direct attacks. So, a government bombs a building, destroys an area, takes over something, kind of forcible, what you would consider within either the laws of war or at a minimum kind of directed, explicit attacks. But I think what I thought was really interesting about the example of the recent wildfires is we often think very clearly about these direct attacks on monuments, on religious sites, but maybe sometimes miss the kind of slow violence of gradual buildup and kind of consolidation of spaces, either through environmental destruction or through consolidating a specific set of settlements that are then going to disrupt and destroy the kind of cultural heritage of peoples who were there. And so I wanted to know how you think about documenting, especially as an architect, that type of much slower, gradual violence, which is maybe less spectacular, less kind of easy to be able to, show a before and an after, but which certainly has a really tremendous impact on people's cultural identity. And maybe Maxime, also that question for you as well, because I think your work focuses on that quite a bit.
Thank you, Angie, for that. I think important question. And it is true that Israel had not ceased to use both, I think, mechanisms, both slow violence that is patient, but also more speedy events that are more spectacular, that are more devastating at the visible level. I think now we're seeing in Israel that is very much the latter than the former, and actually shifts in Israeli policy are related to this question, right? I mean, Israel is not one unit across time; it changes. Yeah, I think, I mean, among the ways that this kind of slow destruction has happened, first, I mean, yeah, this use of the ecology as a way to greenwash. Also, even at the level of street naming and place naming, I mean, changing the toponymy of a city like Jerusalem that, I mean, we know from history belongs to all faiths and all communities, but is now, very ethnically framed surrounding one ethnic group at the cost of others. But also, I think, I mean, perhaps the least spectacular yet the most pertinent form of violence that Israel inflicts on Palestinian culture, but also Palestinian society at large, is not allowing half of the Palestinian population to return, which is a right under UN Resolution 194 of return to their lands and properties that were confiscated in 1948. So we're talking about half, more than half actually, of the Palestinian population who are unable to access their own properties. So that is a form of, and now, of course, they live in refugee camps abroad, and some in better conditions, some in worse conditions. And that helps us think of Gaza, actually, because the majority, more than 80% of Gaza's population are refugees from 1948. And that's an important fact when it comes to understanding that composition, that this population is not actually from there. They're from what is today Israel proper, right? Historic Palestine. And so that is why they are considered a threat to the Israeli idea of what a nation state should be, which is an ethnic state. And that's also why the camps are targeted more than any other spaces within the West Bank. And so understanding, I think, the logics and mechanisms of both how Israeli policy is shaped, but also how it's implemented, I think is key to see where it's a slow process and where in other instances it's a very speedy and spectacular form of destruction. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, I also thought that was an excellent question, and I also appreciated the fire example. But I think that it's kind of coincidentally with the project that I showed, there are examples of that particular thing, like the Soviet kind of flattening of Babin Yar can be one of those examples where it was done by seemingly innocent motives to kind of turn the page and to rebuild the city, but kind of resulted in a lot of issues with memory politics. And for us, for my team, it's particularly painful to see the reconstruction of the by Russian forces of the Mariupol theater. It's something that they will claim is their cultural heritage now. It's something they will claim is kind of, they have rights to that kind of culture of expression in Mariupol. And it also brings me to mention that, you know, like Russian extra statecraft has been very good at using these institutions, including UNESCO, to kind of push their agendas. And I think when we talk about cultural heritage and all possible related topics, it's very important to understand that that itself can be weaponized. It's not only can be bad, as Alexandra said, in a sense that it kind of mobilizes nationalistic narratives. It can also be straight up kind of weapon that is used to justify things and to kind of, you know, shift conversation in particular ways, and in that way, it is one of those kind of slow infrastructures of war that you, Andrzej, mentioned.
Thanks, Maxime. We'll take maybe just two final questions, both from the Q&A. So the first question is about really, can you share the difficulties of working with cultural preservation organizations when their funding sources are at odds with what needs to be preserved? And so the person here is thinking specifically about WMF being funded by tourism companies, which influences much of their thinking. So what do you do when an organization that is in charge of kind of preservation is really kind of has a structure that's at odds with that? Alexandra, maybe I'll turn to you first on this, just given your mandate and that this must be something that you deal with quite a bit. How do you navigate those kinds of questions?
I mean, you know, I'm going to say what my mandate does. You know, we have had issues with that. So first we send them a letter, and we also send a letter to where they have their bases. The state where the organization, non-governmental or transnational corporation, because this happens a lot with transnational corporations as well, are based, also have the obligation not to harm, to ensure that their private entities do not harm human rights abroad. So they don't have to have the same standards abroad, but they definitely have the responsibility, you know, or no harm responsibility. So we send them these two letters. If they don't respond, which sometimes 50% of the cases they don't respond, then we name and shame. And gradually and suddenly, when name and shame is involved, they start getting into discussions. They're long discussions. It's difficult. We do have situations, for example, in Congo, where conservation companies, organizations, sorry, not companies, organizations have are involved even in killing the local indigenous peoples. You know, gross violations And then we try to educate, because we try to train the people in NGOs. We try to train, so that they know and they understand a little bit more. Sometimes, NGOs are in good faith. It's just that they're focused on conservation, and maybe they don't understand fully the other side of the story.
And maybe just to
We try to make sure that we are in all training materials and inventors, etc., and to always be supporting what the local populations want, because maybe the local populations don't see this as their cultural heritage. And who are we to protect something that they don't want protected?
And maybe just a flag for especially the architects in the room and those who are maybe less versed with the UN system. Anybody can submit a complaint to a UN special rapporteur, and you don't have to be a lawyer. And I think especially in areas where traditionally these may be oversights and architects and urban planners and others are seeing violations as they happen. You just have to basically fill out a form and submit a kind of short description of the complaint, and then these mechanisms can kind of take this forward to the state. And so maybe my final question will be taking from the questions here, which is really about what the role is for practicing architects. So the question is, what role do you see for practicing architects? Many of us working for powerful individuals, institutions, and/or governments inside a political system that supports and facilitates the destruction of cultural heritage, kind of in quotes over there, to resist our work against this cultural violence in our practice. So what role can architects kind of maybe play? And maybe for this, I'll turn to Nadia and Maxime, kind of given your training, for what you think can be done for those who are sort of in practice. Maybe Nadia first, and then Maxime to round us up.
Happily, and thank you for the question, Nicholas. I think the arc of possibility is very wide, from the most passive to the most active. At the passive level, perhaps not taking part in projects that are explicitly projects of cultural violation. And the example actually I brought up of the National Library of Israel is a contemporary building built by a Swiss international firm, a very well-known firm, a few years ago. And so that is a recent undertaking. And if you work in a firm where this is the kinds of projects that you're leading, I think you have a say in that context. So the level of the internal, let's say, dynamic of your own firm. But I think, as architects, but also as I think everyone here is passionate beyond their working hours, you can always do things outside your immediate, 9 to 5. The tools of the architect are instrumental for trying and understand destruction, but also possibility when it comes to preservation and conservation. Whether you do that through your practice, whether you do that through writing for architectural magazines, etc. I think the door of possibility for being able to be part of a conversation, I think, are very wide. It just depends on where on the arc you see yourself.
Yeah, to add to that, I think architecture often is an interesting tool to kind of dissect forces that make space, and just practicing that skill in any context where you're involved, even if it's a kind of multifamily housing building, and asking those questions that were kind of mentioned in the beginning by Jacob, but in the broadest possible sense could be helpful, kind of studying how space is produced and what are the actors that kind of are in charge and in control, and what are the actors who are kind of potentially suffering from a certain kind of transformations of this space. So, yeah.
And maybe just to add, from in the international criminal law space, which deals with the most serious international crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of genocide, which is seen as an apex crime. One of the elements, one of the 5 elements of the Genocide Convention, or one of the 5 acts that you can take in showing whether a population has been destroyed in whole or in part, is deliberately inflicting conditions deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And that has been understood to mean the destruction of cultural heritage. And I think the reason for that is the centrality that the international legal system and the international criminal law system places on cultural identity as being critical to the identity of a people's, such that very destruction is itself one of the elements to show genocide, and then the destruction of a people as a whole. So it's, of course, there's the killing and the serious bodily injury, but there's also this, what does it actually mean to be part of a community? What does it mean to have a cultural identity and a group identity? And I think that's critical. And traditionally, this has been the domain of investigators and lawyers, and not architects. And you see through the work of Maxime and others, the ways in which once you start to bring that knowledge source, once you start to think about new technologies, the way in which we start to visualize crimes within a space, how powerful that can be to proving these crimes that are incredibly difficult from a legal perspective to prove, just because of how narrow and how high the standards are. And so I think as a practicing architect, it's critical to be having those conversations with lawyers. I think on the legal side, we often see ourselves as rather insular and kind of charged with looking at crimes and finding them. And then I think on the architectural side, I like to say that sort of architects try to think of yourselves as little gods, kind of designing a space and how you think it will be without it necessarily sort of further engaging in the different uses that it could have and the sort of what is the role of the end user. And so I think more of those kinds of interdisciplinary conversations can be really critical to ensuring greater protection of cultural heritage and cultural identity more generally. And so with this, I think we're largely wrapping up time. Thank you very much to our panelists who are incredibly just rich and have been working on this for years and years and years. I'm incredibly grateful for both the work you're doing as well as the advocacy that you carry out on a daily basis, and of course to the Architectural League for hosting this wonderful conversation.